Hi, this is Dr. Frank Chopatini with the Church of Rational Truth. This week, our Sunday lecture is going to be inspired by current events. Um, Most obviously, the Rittenhouse trial that's going on right now. There was an interesting thing that came up, or at least that the prosecution attempted to bring up during the trial, and that is the concept that it is never morally correct to use lethal force to try and protect property. Basically, the gist of it, or what I believe the gist of the argument was, uh, if people don't know the case, there was a young man. He was 17 at the time. He was defending a piece of personal property, or he's attempting to help defend a piece of personal property from a dangerous situation. There were people who were protesting, and then there were some people who were rioting. It was becoming dangerous. He brought a gun to help protect that area, and then later, afterwards, after that event took place, he did end up shooting several people. We're not going to get into the trial. We're not going to get into the morality of the trial. But during that trial, one of the prosecutors brought up this line of questioning that kind of tried to bring out this idea of if it is never morally okay to use lethal force to protect property, why would you bring that gun? He tried to make it seem like if that is not morally appropriate, then the only reason you brought that gun was to try to shoot people. He didn't get allowed this line of questioning. The judge was not happy about it. He got a very stern talking to because it was supposed to be outside the scope of the trial. But I think it does raise an interesting moral question. Is it ever justified to use lethal force to protect personal property? Am I allowed to use my gun to stop someone from destroying a car, a vehicle I own, or some other piece of personal property? And they really push that this is never moral. Absolutely, it's not moral. You wouldn't do it. So why would you think it's justified? And I would argue that it theoretically could be justified. I'm not saying it is. I'm not taking anyone's side on this. I was just kind of going over the moral aspects of it. And even though it kind of pains me to say it, and it's not really a great internal humanistic feeling, but I would say you could argue that there at some point is a morally acceptable time to use lethal force to protect property. Now, obviously, this comes with a whole bunch of strings attached to it, and I would say probably in the majority of cases, it is probably not morally justified to take a human life for it. But like like everything we talk about, it depends on a whole lot of factors. And I think that you can't just make this. This prosecutor was trying to kind of make this blanket statement of no, you could never justify that. Therefore, such and such and such and such. If he was coming at me at the stand, I would say it really depends. It depends on all the situations, all the little factors, and I can't give you a yes or no right now. Is it morally justifiable? I would say it depends on so many factors. I would say one of the big factors is how much is that property worth? I hate saying this, but doctors do this all the time. Lawmakers do this all the time. Insurance policymakers do this all the time. You have to put a dollar amount to human life in some situations, and this happens a lot. It's a terrible thing. We don't like to think of our lives having a physical dollar amount, but we do this all the time. So sometimes it's valued at $200,000, sometimes $2 million. It depends on the context, but a lot of people say that, or a lot of people do actually equate a physical dollar amount to a human life. With that being said, if you, let's say, completely remove emotions from this, and I had an X dollar amount of value that is going to be lost versus one human life, you would argue that if those things are actually the case, if I can equate a human life to an actual value, a dollar amount, that if the dollar amount is a certain amount in terms of damage being done, it is worth to take that human life. That is a very mathematical approach to the morality, and that logic, I think, only applies if you do agree that there is a calculable value to a human life, because then it becomes a very easy moral equation. If you really got to remove the human element, but then it just becomes a is this piece of property worth more than that human life? Therefore, then it is justified because mathematically we've done more good. Obviously, that's very simplistic and it doesn't really take everything into account, but I would say that is one thing is if you were to take a piece of property that is worth $600 trillion, more than all the wealth in the world versus one human life, and that person, is going to destroy it unless you kill them, I would say that's much more likely to be morally justified. Um, I would say another aspect of it And the reverse is also true. If someone's trying to steal $5 and you're going to shoot him, or you're going to possibly take that person's life, that clearly is not morally justified. A human life is not worth that much loss. You would probably just rather take the loss than risk injuring or taking someone's life. So I would say there's that huge spectrum. $50 trillion versus $5. Somewhere in between there's going to be a part where it becomes more and more moral to possibly make that decision. Now, with most personal property, we're not talking about huge amounts of values, but I do think that there is a point in terms of value, in terms of protection, that you could get to it where you'd say, well, yeah, this business was worth millions of dollars. That's possibly at that point where it's worth taking a life. But you could argue that point for a very long time. I would say it depends on the society, on the person, how much you value life, how much you don't value life. And then you probably try to get to some dollar amount where you would say, I think above this, it's probably justified. But we're not here to argue that amount. I would say the argument is at some point you could argue that. I would say the second part of the morality is for the person who is losing their life, would they reasonably believe that their actions could end in them losing their lives? So, is the person aware that they could be dying by doing this thing? And I would say if the person is not aware that they could be losing their life for doing this, it becomes a lot less moral to actually take their life. If it was a complete surprise, like it was an empty abandoned house, or it looked like it was empty and abandoned, and I was thinking about robbing it, and you're going to put a booby trap in there. There's stories that are done in case law for law school all the time, talking about the booby trap and are you allowed to booby trap something to protect your house from someone doing something illegal. I would say in that case, it becomes much more immoral or incredibly immoral if that person doesn't go in with some sort of understanding that they could lose their life from doing this thing. They try to rob a house or destroy a house, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they end up getting killed. That is a lot less justifiable. That person does not know the implications of their actions. They probably wouldn't have done that action if they thought that lethal force could be used. So I would say it kind of, if you're looking at an overall general situation and the person is completely unaware that lethal force could be used to protect them, it is a lot less justifiable. Now, not to say that automatically makes it immoral. If I'm going to go blow up the Statue of Liberty, I should probably be able to understand that could come with lethal force, something giant and dangerous. I should be kind of aware or assume, even though there's not clearly armed guards, I should be able to see internally that that's not moral or that risk is there. So that's not enough to just excuse it, to just say, oh, this person didn't know lethal force could be used. But I would say that is definitely a factor in it. If they did not think, or in a reasonable situation where lethal force would be used, it's a lot less moral to use lethal force because they didn't see that as part of their judgment in terms of whether they do that activity. If they knew lethal force could be used, they are a lot less likely to do it. There's a couple of other situations where I would say the flip side. If they knew lethal force would be used for their actions, that I think it makes it a bit more moral. If someone knows that if you're gonna, you for a fact are going to shoot them if you try to burn down their house, that makes it a lot less immoral. I'm not saying it's right just to tell someone I'm going to shoot you, but I think that is something that you should weigh in terms of tipping the scales. That doesn't immediately justify it. Doesn't mean that you can just say I'll shoot you if you do this and shoot them. But if it's a situation where that is part of it, I think that has to be weighed in. It's, once again, not decisive whether it's moral or immoral, but it kind of pushes you a little bit towards one side or towards the other side. Another aspect related to this is the person of the right mindset to understand that and the implications of that. One of the parts during the trial is whether the first victim was actually actively suicidal, and are they trying to commit suicide through running at someone with a gun, kind of like suicide by cop. If that's the case, then it also becomes, I would say, a little bit less moral on that point. If that person has a known death wish and they're only doing this to try and trigger someone to kill them, I would say it's a lot less moral because now you're only furthering that activity from others and you're only justifying that person's wild actions. And then you could end up seeing theoretically more people who are trying to kill themselves by provoking someone who's armed. But then again, how are you going to know the mindset of someone who is potentially destroying your property? So it's something that should be taken into account. I think with this case, it's very interesting because the first victim did seem to have mental health issues, including suicidal ideation, which might have taken part of this decision of, do you take someone who's mentally ill's life, that really shifts things a lot. So I would say those are kind of the biggest points of whether it's justified. I do think there's a tipping point where you can say, yes, at this point you are justified in taking a life to protect property. But I would say it really depends on the intrinsics of it. And I would say the majority, probably not. In most cases, if the person doesn't clearly threaten your life or the lives of other people, it is really, really hard to justify it. So I'm not necessarily taking that side. I'm not necessarily saying, oh, anybody is justified to shoot. But I would say there are probably sets of circumstances where you could argue that it is morally justified. Like everything with the Church of Rational Truth, it depends on specifics and it's relative. It's very hard in this case to just make a sweeping generalization that it's always moral or it's always immoral. I would say it's more likely, well, we need to talk about these set of circumstances where it would probably be more moral to take that action. That being said, some old business. For voting, we're going to be between reinvesting in the general endowment or putting the money towards a physical church/library. That voting will take place this week, and then we will tally the votes. And then next week, we will reveal where the passive income will be going. Once again, this is Dr. Frank Ciopatini with the Church of Rational Truth. Thank you all, and have a great week. Bye-bye.